This is Sam Zien, also known as Sam the Cooking Guy here on YouTube. He's a talented chef, super successful entrepreneur, and a very popular YouTuber who posted a video on how to smoke a Texas-style brisket for home cooks. However, there were some big problems with his brisket that with a few minor tweaks could easily be avoided. And I'm gonna go over those tweaks today so that if you do try his recipe at home, your brisket will turn out even better than his.
Why don't you make a brisket? Yeah, you should make a brisket. We want you to make a brisket. How come you haven't made a brisket? Aren't you gonna make a brisket? You gotta smoke or make a brisket. Fine, I'm making a brisket.
Man, this guy has so much personality. He was like made for TV and YouTube. But off the bat, we're seeing some shots of his finished brisket. And first and foremost, just from these introduction shots that I'm seeing, out of all the briskets that I have reacted to thus far, so the Adam Mercutio one, Joshua Weissman, and even my own first brisket, this is easily the best one. He rendered that fat band in the middle of the brisket, didn't dry it out, and the texture of the meat is only slightly overcooked on some of the spots, which is really hard to do, especially if you cook in a pellet grill like Sam does here. All fantastic things, but there are still some major problems that I'm seeing. He has a big glob of unrendered fat on the top of the brisket, and that is just super blubbery and chewy. And for a Texas brisket bark, even on a pellet grill, that should be a lot darker. But I'll share how all of these problems can be easily fixed along with any others that I find along the way as we watch Sam cook this brisket.
Cooking a brisket is not complicated. I've done it a bunch of times. We're gonna follow the rules today. There's 5 steps. Trim, season, smoke, wrap, and continue to smoke, and then rest.
He's not wrong. Brisket is fairly simple to do, especially if you're gonna use a pellet grill like Sam does in this video. But you can absolutely get incredible results on your brisket without fail every single time if you can just master 3 things. Number 1 is a nice bark, which means that the crust is set and dark and the top fat is completely rendered. Number 2 is that the internal fat and collagen is completely broken down, meaning the meat on the inside is tender and not chewy. And finally, number 3, the meat is not overcooked. So you should be able to get some really nice slices out of it instead of it just turning into pulled beef as soon as you try to cut. And with the 6 steps that Sam shared, you can absolutely get all 3 of these factors done. So absolutely nothing wrong with Sam's 6-step method, but just know that there are other ways to do it.
Each one is very important, especially that resting one. Nobody's going anywhere. They want a brisket, they're getting a brisket. It's only one way to do it with some time, and we're doing that.
Like I said, multiple ways you can cook a brisket, but Sam is absolutely right here. You cannot skip the rest. Basically, the proteins get bound up when it's cooked, and it just needs time to relax once it's done. That way, the brisket will retain all of that beautiful juice. If you don't rest your brisket, even if you cook it perfectly, once you slice into it, all of the juice is gonna spill out of it, and the brisket's gonna end up very dry.
And our first step is trimming. So let's get this kid out of the bag. This is called the heel. This we don't want. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to make holes where fat used to be, because that's just going to be a spot that the seasoning can get trapped and it won't cook properly.
Yes, one of the problems with those pockets is uneven seasoning, but the bigger problem is pooling, which is when the juice from the brisket collects in those pockets and wrecks the bark.
This is basically silver skin, and that fat is not gonna render down and not do good things for anybody.
That is some expert level silver skin removal. Beautiful. Overall, for a backyard brisket trim for a pellet grill, this is really good. I can tell he's cooked more than a few briskets in his backyard. Great technique.
Seasoning for him, it's very important. So in my shaker, I'm gonna put equal parts of kosher salt, black pepper, and garlic powder. So again, somebody's out there going, dude, you've already made a mistake. You can't possibly be using garlic powder. Well, guess what? I am.
So a lot of people who live outside of Texas believe that Texas barbecue joints only use kosher salt and 16 mesh black pepper. But nowadays, Cat's kind of out of the bag on this thanks to Jerby Barbecue and Mad Scientist Barbecue sharing that a lot of Texas barbecue joints actually use Lawry's and other complex rubs in tandem with the kosher salt and the coarse pepper. Personally, I love the taste of Lawry's on brisket, but More recently, I've been using Goldie's brisket rub, and let me tell you, it is phenomenal. But with that said, you can absolutely just use salt and pepper and a little bit of garlic like Sam's doing here and still come out with a delicious brisket.
There it is. And we're ready for the smoker. And we're on. We'll close it up. The smoker's set to 250 degrees.
Okay, so this here is a major contributing factor as to why Sam's brisket at the beginning of the video had that big lump of unrendered fat on it. So the way pellet grills work, like the one that Sam is using here, is there's a fire pot right under the grate where the brisket is sitting that burns pellets and produces hot smoke, but also gives off a ton of radiant heat. Because of this, you want to keep the brisket as far away from the fire pot as possible, which is why if you have the option, you want to put your brisket on the top rack in your pellet smoker. And if your pellet smoker doesn't have a second rack, you can just go on Amazon and buy a foldable rack for like 20 bucks and it'll do exactly the same thing. And some of you might be thinking, how will lifting the brisket only a few inches make that much of a difference? And to this I say, it absolutely will. And you can see for yourself how much of a difference this makes the next time you go to a bonfire. Notice how putting your hands further or closer to the fire can be the difference between feeling cold and feeling like the heat is about to peel off the skin from your hands. Alternatively, if your pellet smoker doesn't have a second rack and you don't want to spend the 20 bucks, you could put your brisket on the main rack and then just cook it really low at like 190 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And although it's not as optimal as raising the brisket, it will still allow enough time for the bark to get nice and dark and for that fat on top to render. But because Sam is cooking his brisket on the bottom rack and he's cooking it pretty hot at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, this brisket is gonna cook hot and fast, and the bark and the fat render is gonna suffer greatly.
We're looking for an internal temperature when the brisket is finished of between 200 and 205 degrees.
So a brisket is done when it's done. Every brisket has a different amount of internal fat, collagen, etc. So you can't really give a specific internal temperature when you're cooking a brisket on an offset. But over this previous summer, I cooked so many briskets on pellet grills, and every single brisket finished exactly between 200 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit. So in my opinion, and a lot of my barbecue buddies here on YouTube are probably gonna wanna stone me for this, but I think Sam is absolutely right here.
This has now been on 4 hours and 45 minutes. Should we have a little look at it? Come on, come on. So let's get this guy off. It's pretty hot, but I can do it. Oh, that was hot.
Yeah, he's an absolute madman for taking that off with his fingers. Pellet grill briskets are so hot to the touch. I do not recommend that you do this, but also do not use oven mitts or a towel to take the brisket off, because that hot fat and juice will seep into the fabric and will deep fry your hands. Ask me how I know. So now I use nitrile gloves and cotton liners because I barbecue a lot, so it's worth the expense to me. But if you just cook brisket like once or twice a year tops, then I'd say just wrap your hands in a bunch of tin foil and that will work perfectly too.
Now, step 3, the wrap.
And this is the second mistake that caused the big problem that I talked about at the top of the video. Sam wrapped this brisket way too early. So there's a point when you're cooking a brisket where the moisture from the brisket is releasing and cooling it down, which counteracts the cooking that's occurring, and this makes the temperature stall, which is why people call this stage the stall. And the reason why Sam is wrapping the brisket here is because he's trying to push past the stall. But in my opinion, just based on how the brisket looked, I think he should have left it in the stall for about an hour or so before he wrapped it. This would have given him more smoke on the brisket, a darker bark, and it also would have allowed the fat on top of the brisket to render more.
There we are, a nice little package that now goes right back on the smoker. I didn't put the temperature probe in. Screw it. Because here's the thing, that will just give us a guide. At some point, it's less about temperature, but more about the tenderness of it.
Spoken like a professional pitmaster. Don't go off of the temperature, go off of the tenderness. That's it. The secret to barbecue. But yeah, like I said before, 99.8% of the time, that's gonna be 200 to 205 when you're cooking on a pellet smoker.
I'm decided I need to put the probe back in. Because I'm flying blind here. I need some idea of when this is getting close.
I love this guy. I feel like so many barbecue channels and just cooking channels in general will often try and fake out the audience like they never make mistakes. But Sam is built different, man. I love it.
And there you have it, our internal end goal temperature of 201. Oh, it just went to 202. Let's just kill the smoker and we'll take our friend off. So, I'll tell you something. You see this? I don't know if you can get what's going on. There's this flexibility thing that is what you want.
That is a great sign. If your brisket bends like that straight off of the cooker, that means the collagen is completely broken down, which means a super tender brisket.
Grab up our brisket, and we go like that. A couple more towels, and we're done. Your resting time should be 2 hours.
I disagree with Sam here. I don't think you should rest your brisket based off of time, but rather the internal temperature of the brisket. I slice my brisket when it drops down to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, but anywhere between 140 to 160 is perfect. Also, because he's only resting his brisket for 2 hours, he should definitely not use a cooler. The brisket is still gonna be really hot after only 2 hours in an insulated cooler, so I fully expect that when he slices the brisket, he's gonna lose a lot of juice to the cutting board like we talked about earlier.
Oh, hi. So before I open this guy up, just let me say one thing. I'm a cook. I'm not a barbecue guy. This is out of my general wheelhouse. In 1, 2, 3. Ow, it's hot. Oh.
Outside of not getting a darker bark and that big blob of fat on the top of the brisket, Sam rocked this cook. The meat looks tender and juicy. For a beginner brisket, this is clearly the best one I've reacted to thus far. So the new tier list update is Sam's brisket, and then Adam Ragusia's, and then Joshua Weissman's. But the gap between Sam and Adam's brisket is monumental. Like, they're not even in the same stratosphere. So make sure you watch the next video on your screen where I reviewed Adam Ragusia's Texas style brisket so you can see just how much worse it is.